Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring future creators, and for all those that like really great stories. I'm Ira Pastor, your exponential health ambassador along for this journey. So on previous shows, we've spent a lot of time discussing what I refer to as sort of the bioarchitecture of life, spending various time at different levels of this unique hierarchy, from the extremely small, as we've delved into topics like quantum biology, to the very large, as we've discussed themes like chronobiology, and everything in between, genomics, the microbiome, systems biology. Today, however, we are going to go further and deeper than we have gone before, and I'm really looking forward to today's guest and the scope of the discussion. Ilia Delio is a Franciscan Sister, Order of St. Francis of Washington, D.C., and holds the Josephine C. Connelly Endowed Chair in Theology at Villanova University. She is a native of Newark, New Jersey. She originally earned her bachelor's in biology at DeSalle University, a master's in biology at Seton Hall, and a doctorate in pharmacology from Rutgers University, go Scarlet Knights, with an emphasis in neurotoxicology and neuromuscular diseases, where she wrote a dissertation on axonal dysfunction in experimental models of Lou Gehrig's disease. She then moved from pharmacology during her postdoc period to obtain a doctorate in historical theology from Fordham University. Following her graduation from Fordham, she taught in science and religion at Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut. And for the following 12 years, she was professor and chair of spirituality studies at Washington Theological Union, where she taught courses in the history of Christianity, Franciscan theology, and science and religion. She then became a senior research fellow at the Woodstock Theological Center at Georgetown University, concentrating on science and religion. She's a recipient of a Templeton Course in Science and Religion Award and the author of 17 books, including The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, which won the 2014 Silver Nautilus Award, and a Catholic Press Association Book Award. Other books she's written include A Care for Creation, The Emergent Christ, Making All Things New, Catholicity, Cosmology and Consciousness, nominated for the 2018 Guilmeier Award. She lectures nationally and internationally on topics as diverse as evolution, artificial intelligence, consciousness, culture, and religion. Dr. Leo's work at the intersection of science and religion is heavily influenced by the teachings of the Jesuit scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who devoted his spiritual writing to bridging Christianity and evolution. And like Desjardins, she sees the essential need to integrate science and religion towards really a new way of thinking. Her research interests focus on exploring divine action in a world of evolution, complexity, emergence, quantum reality, and artificial intelligence. She continues to lecture and write on religion and evolution, Catholicity, cosmology, culture, artificial intelligence, and human becoming. And she's also the head of the Omega Center here in Pennsylvania, whose mission is to deepen Teilhard de Chardin's integration of science and spirituality, providing insight and practices to enkindle awareness of love at the very heart of reality. All that being said, Ilia Delio, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Ira. It's good to be here.
It's a real pleasure having you. Could you we typically start off by giving our guests the floor to talk a little bit about themselves. If you could just go back in time a bit and talk a little bit about your journey from your interest in science to pharmacology, and then ultimately into theology and what you're doing today at Villanova.
Sure. Yeah, I love science, actually. When I was a teenager, I had grand dreams of winning a Nobel Prize, as a scientist. And I wanted to be a doctor originally. So I didn't, have because my mother was a nurse and I didn't want to be a nurse. So that was my reason to be a doctor. But I was a bio major in college, minor in chemistry. And for me, the sciences were the path to truth. So I had very little regard, quite honestly, for the humanities and for religion. I went to a Catholic undergrad school, DeSales University, and my theology courses were something I had to take. And so I persevered through them, but I learned very little because I was a snob. I was a science snob. And so I thought, well, what could this possibly, how can this possibly enlighten me? And so I went on to grad school eventually in science, and I became enamored by neurobiology. I was in neurobiology in the early 80s when the field itself was just beginning to really grow into a full-blown discipline of neuroscience. It was a very exciting time to be in the field, and I think it's one of the most exciting areas today. So I was at New Jersey Medical School, and which is now part of Rutgers University, and I wound up in the area of neurophysiology. So the spinal cord was just a mini brain. You could work out the circuits a little bit easier. The brain is so complex, but I love the field of neuroscience in the general sense of neuroscience, neuropharm, neurophysiology, neuropathology. I was working on a model of Lou Gehrig's disease using an experimental drug that would mimic the pathology of Lou Gehrig's disease. So I was an electrophysiologist. That actually was my particular area. So I worked on the electrical dysfunction of the components of the neuromuscular junction that's involved in Lou Gehrig's disease.
Sure.
Cool stuff, really. And I actually had signed on for a postdoc at Johns Hopkins in a neurology, neuropathology unit that was looking at related pathologies like Lou Gehrig's, which would, among those related pathologies would be Alzheimer's disease. So they were what we call neurofilament diseases. And so I signed on, as the electrophysiologist. But in the meantime, I had come across the work of Thomas Merton, this monk, this Trappist monk who, went through Columbia University and had a profound conversion and went to live in a very strict Cistercian monastery. And when I read his life, I just saw my life in his life. And so I was really deeply inspired to just relinquish this career in research science and to live in a monastery in this total self-offering to God. And I had no idea really what I was doing, but but it was deeply attractive. So I made this decision. My colleagues thought she definitely either had a breakdown from being in the lab too much, or maybe inhaled a chemical or something. But I was not overtly religious as a scientist. I was one of those closet religious people. And I went through that phase of agnosticism, where I just thought the whole thing of religion was just hokey pokey and, kind of made up myths. And then I knew that there was something tugging deep within me. And so Merton helped me awaken to that God presence, if I can use that language. And I eventually entered a very traditional monastery and was there for 4 years. And I likened it to the Shawshank Redemption, because after 2 years, I thought, okay, now that the honeymoon has worn off, how can I get myself out of here? So it was strict work and prayer. We worked, it was all manual labor, baking and gardening and, carpentry, and then we prayed for 6 hours a day. So I went from this life, I was, I don't know how many years in school, 21 years total, I guess, and then I went into this monastery. And I guess I'm a radical person, in one way or the other. So I eventually left the monastery and joined a community of Franciscan followers of St. Francis of Assisi. And I was a very traditional Catholic for some odd reason. I mean, it's what I knew from my childhood. So I was a scientist on one hand, and then I was kind of this traditional Catholic on another. And I didn't think these two worlds could ever meet or had anything in common with each other. So this is a very strange story, I have to tell you. I joined the Franciscans, and I actually went back to research. I did a postdoc at Rutgers University in neurotoxicology. I was hired by Fidia Pharmaceutical Company in Italy to work on an experimental compound they were looking at in terms of diabetic neuropathy. So I was the lead researcher there. But when I went back to research, something had changed for me in the monastery, and the science no longer had the, it was still really fun and attractive, and yet there was something missing. Maybe that God component was missing from it. And, I couldn't really talk about religion, and my colleagues were like, we really respect what you did, but now that you're back to normal, we're glad you're here again. So they were really wonderful guys. Really, they were all men, and they were just wonderful people, but they could not get their heads around the religious side of my journey. I myself, I had nothing in common with the women that I was living with, because I was a researcher, and I would come home and they would say, well, how are your rats today? That was the extent of our conversation. To make a long story short, the community asked me to study theology, and I said, gosh, I have no idea of anything in theology. The course I took in college, I basically slept through. So they said, please just even think about a master's degree in spirituality or something. So I did. I went to Fordham University and started studying theology. And I said, okay, how much I didn't know about theology. First of all, it really is a much more bona fide discipline than I gave it credit for. And I was really enamored by the early church fathers and the way the medievalists thought about these questions of God and creation. It was very, really, it was a science in its own right, and I had to eventually awaken to the fact that, wow, theology was known as the queen of all, sciences in the Middle Ages. Like, all knowledge was, in a sense, to wind up in theology. So I wound up studying under a leading scholar of Bonaventure, who was a Franciscan theologian and a contemporary of Thomas Aquinas. And Bonaventure had so Franciscan theology takes the material world seriously as the place where God is to be found. And Bonaventure really developed this whole theology of the human person and the wider creation, what we call the microcosm and the macrocosm. And he developed it in what we call a Christocentrism. Not that everyone is to become Catholic or Christ or anything like this, rather that divine love is found in the heart of materiality throughout the whole of creation. And so part of my dissertation was looking at Bonaventure and this Jesuit, Teilhard de Chardin, and Teilhard's ideas were very consonant with Bonaventure. And so that was my first kind of, segue into the world of this thinker, Teilhard de Chardin. And as my career sort of, began to take shape, my first teaching job was in science and religion. And I naively thought, hey, science and religion, I have 2 doctorates, this is easy. Until I had to teach this class, realizing this is a whole field where people have been thinking and writing for the last 60 years. And so every night I was in a mound of books trying to make my way through it. I do think with Alfred North Whitehead that these are the two pillars of human civilization, of cosmic thinking. I mean, unless we understand how science and religion work together, without collapsing them into one another, without trying to form some type of blending, homogenizing, that we really can't come to a more unified world, a different type of human community and a cosmic community. So a lot of my work over the last 15 years has been devoted to, understanding first the relationship between science and religion, and then Teilhard's work has really helped me develop an integrated vision of science and religion. Teilhard himself was a paleontologist, so he was a bona fide scientist. I have someone gave me the complete set of his scientific writings. He was a detailed scientist. He really, was very attentive to the details of his own studies. And yet he felt that there was something more going on in material creation than could be accounted for by science alone.
Sure.
And therefore he began writing on faith and science, from his perspective, Christianity and evolution. And he talked about a power, within. He did not accept, funny enough, he was an evolutionary biologist, but he didn't take Darwin's evolution as the final story of evolution, because he felt Darwin left out the essential role of consciousness, and this is way before panpsychism and, before what we know about consciousness today. So it's really quite interesting. Teilhard was very attentive and in tune with the science of his own day, of the scientists, a lot of conversation partners. So he really opted for what we call the Bergsonian notion of creative evolution, that there's what Bergson says, there's an élan vital, or a vital impulse, or there's something else going on here. propels it, that kind of moves it to transcend itself towards higher realms of consciousness and being. And that's attractive. By
Mhm.
no means is this, a lot of people dispel this idea, but I think what Terry was just saying descriptively, there's more to evolution than meets the eye, right?
Sure.
There's more than evolution that just meets what we can measure or identify.
Mhm.
Um, and so I have found that attractive, and using his paradigms, have begun to talk about a new philosophy.
Mhm.
He talked about love as a core energy, and he certainly didn't mean love, the sentiment of love or the emotion of love. He meant love as a deep, what he called
Right.
a personal center-to-center attraction. There's an attractability in nature, which is
Mhm.
really interesting, right? That, we can talk about electron exchange or ion exchange, but that doesn't really account for why there is this force of attraction.
Right.
And so he speaks about love. He looks at matter as having what we call today a dual aspect monism, something that
Mm.
Carl Jung, Wolfgang Pauli, and others realized that consciousness, again, we can't talk about matter apart from consciousness.
Right.
I mean, Teilhard recognized that, right? So consciousness is sort of the name of the game. You can't extract the mind and just talk about matter. That's just
Mhm.
not possible.
Right.
So Teilhard spoke about an inside of matter and sort of a withinness and a withoutness. There's consciousness and attraction. And he speaks about love as that core energy that has these dual components, consciousness and attraction. And so he says, love is the core energy of the universe. That
Mhm.
the whole universe, he says the physical structure of the universe is love. That's not a religious statement. That he's saying this from a physical perspective,
Sure.
which is
Sure.
really fascinating in itself.
Absolutely.
So I've been building on these ideas now for the last number of years, and the Omega Center is really devoted now to kind of deepening this understanding of religion and science working together with a core energy of love at the heart of the universe, and where this might move us toward.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Yeah. Thank you for that overview. And there's a lot of things here I'd love to go into, and because I just think they're so fundamental to the whole story. But as you were saying, so Teilhard was trained as a paleontologist, and he conceived of many very important ideas. Not that one more important than the other, but two of obviously the major ones. I spent time reading about. He came up with this idea of an omega point, or sort of this complexity or consciousness. You're mentioning that the universe, in a sense, was evolving towards, as well as sort of this evolutionary state of development, this noosphere, where sort of the mind, the consciousness of the mind, or the mind becomes sort of central to everything that's going on in the universe. And I find sort of, and I stole, I have some quotes here that I stole from some of your presentations, but basically where, quoting from him, religion and evolution should neither be confused nor divorced. They're destined to form one single continuous organism,
Right.
in which their lives are prolonged and so forth. And I find this very intriguing, because one of the battles that always goes on sort of in the life sciences, as should we look at the human body as a machine, which is externally purposed, having these different parts working together, or is the human body an organism, which has, it's self-organizing, self-producing, self-maintaining, regenerating, constantly emerging and changing. And I find in these definitions of Teilhard's work, where we use the terms basically of an evolving universe, a continuous organism, that he's really taking this organismic perspective on the whole cosmos, that it's much more than just a machine that some invisible guy up there is pushing some buttons, but really
For sure.
living as a whole. And if you could talk about that a little bit, I mean, that's just a fascinating sort of basis for a lot of them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, certainly I think, the scientists themselves are moving beyond a Newtonian worldview, if I just use that term broadly, a mechanistic type of paradigm, the body as machine. Certainly we know from cosmology, the universe is no longer a machine world, that it is an unfolding, a Big Bang universe. I think even in the life sciences, you know, the advent of quantum biology, for example,
Yep.
you know, we're beginning to realize the way systems work, that, you know, even neurons, a neuron doesn't work independent and isolated from anything else. So
Right.
deep relationality, and finding the way things work in terms of network connections.
Mm-hmm.
So that is moving us into a new framework. And so what Teilhard kind of realized is that what we are, I mean, two things. One is philosophically we are shifting. You know, I think science, and the way I like to do things today is I do think I like to begin with what science is telling us. Science never has the last word, because science itself is always an explanation.
Sure.
But the description of what we can now say about, you know, material creation does give us then content to reflect on. You know, and that's where philosophy comes in. Like, well, what is being? If we use that language of being, a human being, what's a human being?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, you know, terms like open systems and complex dynamical systems, in terms of relationality or entanglement. These
Mm-hmm.
are concepts that enable us to begin to rethink human personhood. And when we do that, we're moving out of a mechanistic paradigm. You know, we're not machine parts put together.
Yep.
We are, in a sense, we can't separate ourselves from the environment in which we find ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So even the term flesh, you know, or body itself, is not this autonomous, constrained entity, but the self of the self is an ongoing dynamic process with the environment. I mean, in some ways, you know, if we think of ourselves as the universe, the whole universe on the level of a self-thinking subject or a self-conscious subject, that's a really fascinating way to say that what we are, even materially or bodily, is, you know, part and parcel of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are, in this sense, we really are cosmic beings. I mean, that term just sounds like we're something flying around in the atmosphere, but what we're saying is the whole universe, in a sense, because we are the thinking, you know, we're the thinking vanguard, you might say, of the universe. So the only way to name the universe is out of this conscious mind that we have. And that in itself is just a fascinating phenomenon, as a phenomenon.
Absolutely.
I think this bodily awareness that we have, I like the philosopher Merleau-Ponty speaks about the body as being the flesh of the world. In other words, it extends into the world itself. So that I do think the whole area of cybernetics is so interesting in terms of human personhood, right? We are part and parcel of that which we call world. You know, we create this world. We are in this world is part of us. So it's this process of a dynamic interrelationship that we can't separate these things out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, you know, it really is. It's fundamental how we think about science and religion, because our thoughts are shaping what we are and what this world becomes, right? We can't just we're not passive spectators here. We're not just planted in the world. We are this world in its own evolving or its own becoming. So the body, again, is not a Cartesian body, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have minds that are just implanted in this thing called body, because in that way, a dualism, you know, it persists, where we say, the body is just a hardware for the software. You know, we can take our plugs out, right? Our USB plugs of the mind and replant them in a new medium, you know, and rather than, you know, maybe this body mind is a whole entity that however we think, even in terms of artificial intelligence, we have to think in terms of embodiment. Embodiment is part and parcel of what it means to be intelligent life. So
thank you for that. And that's a wonderful explanation. And listening to you, you know, you're talking about, you know, a lot of terms that you have a theme. Once again, I've watched several of your lectures, and I've tried to absorb as much as possible so I can intelligently communicate with you during this conversation. But you know, one of the core concepts that you you lecture about is this topic of relational wholeness, or relational cosmos, where, as you were just saying, some of these, you were talking about some different components. One, sort of this holonic nature of things that, although we try, and I apologize, I keep going back to life sciences, but while in the life science, we constantly try to reduce everything. We look at DNA and these proteins here. DNA by itself does nothing outside of the architecture of a cell. Cells by themselves do nothing outside of various biomechanical and biophysical forces of tissues. So, from the small to the large, it's all connected. And then a lot of this, in a similar fashion, when we talk about consciousness, and as you were saying, you mentioned panpsychism before, but one of the fascinating things that, I keep my eye on, when we're, here we are in 2019, and consciousness. So it's still such a difficult subject for many to grasp. But the neat thing I personally think on the side is all of these things that sort of make up human cognition in the mind. We're talking about sensing and perception and behavior and valence and memory and learning and so forth. What do we find? We're finding not only is all that stuff inside here, but it's also in bacteria. We see them we see plants doing the same stuff. And so I think it's really neat that we're beginning to see at sort of the very edges of some of these disciplines that, there's consciousness in a lot of places. It's not just the human, inside the human skull. And so I really think this principle of wholeness, whether it's, physical wholeness or mental or consciousness, is really a very elegant relationship that you describe per this concept, and it's really it has we'll say evidence in so many different areas of the sciences. And I'm focusing a lot on biology because
it's really true, though. Right. I mean, so it's not to negate reductionism, because in science you have to, in a sense, isolate certain things in order to study them. Certainly. But all we're saying here is that reductionism is not the goal here, right? It's not the end. So, you can isolate the double helix, you can isolate the protein, of a certain, but once you isolate it, you study it to understand it precisely because it belongs to a larger whole, and you understand its function within that whole. And so that's what we're saying here is that, every part has its own intrinsic worth and its own intrinsic function and its own intrinsic mechanism, and yet it's not self-sufficient, that it's actually part of something more than itself. So I like that term by Arthur Kessler, a holon, like holes within holes within holes. And so tracing that back, even to the earliest, on a cosmological level, the earliest universe, is a sort of like undifferentiated wholeness of energy, and so it's kind of fascinating that if that stuff, if the whole of the whole is consciousness itself, which is, a speculation today that consciousness may be, the very whole of everything that's whole. So what does that mean? We don't know, because we don't even know what consciousness really is. But the fact that it is means there's some type of informational exchange. Consciousness is not information per se. Those are two distinguished ideas, and yet there is a flow. There's a flow. Something, is an overlapping. One physicist, speculated, is it due to the overlapping of wave, of the wave particle duality, the sharing, the overlapping of waves of some sort? I don't know. I just take, a lot of these ideas are very interesting just to reflect on. That phenomenologically, that it is, I think we're beginning to say more and more, yes, we can't get beyond consciousness. We can't put it to the side and just talk about, matter itself. So there's a wholeness that it is unbearable, if I can use that word, right? It's unbearable because it almost is more powerful than what we are in our individual nature. We're drawn to wholeness. I mean, I look today, even on our cultural level, we're attracted to whole foods. Not the company, but we're attracted to holistic medicine.
Exactly.
There's something we've been so mechanized from the Newtonian world that we don't do well with isolated parts, because there's something at the heart of our life that is already whole, and that whole is existentially, you might say, the root reality of what we're about. And so we keep searching for it in different ways, which is why I do think, artificial intelligence has emerged in a sense because of a deep longing for wholeness,
Mm-hmm.
in a century that was so violent and disruptive and disconnected,
Mm-hmm.
and where, the modern utopia idea was just a failure. And so, in the shattering, in the brutal, shattered pieces of two world wars, nature says, we're looking for wholeness. We're looking to be connected
Mm-hmm.
beyond these shattered pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, if I go back to nature, this pluripotential word,
Yep.
nature, it's an umbrella term for, all this incredible, dynamic, entangled stuff of life
Mm-hmm.
at its root level. There's something about nature that is indivisibly whole, I'm attracted to David Bohm's idea of an implicate order,
Mm-hmm.
of that kind of idea that it persists. This in Bohm's, there's a quantum potential, a divine potential. However, we want to speak about this incredible intrinsic wholeness. It's there, and it persists in the ongoing movement of life. And in my view, in Teilhard's view, it's the very thing that moves life, and it's the very thing that's ahead of life. So that's the interesting thing here. I think as long as we, and I think creativity is a movement toward that wholeness. We're not aware, we don't talk in those terms. We're not even conscious sometimes. But to talk in terms of parts, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not attracted to a part.
Yeah.
I'm not attracted to like a single cell. That just doesn't do it for me.
Exactly.
I'm not attracted to an ion. I am attracted to a person because that person is in a sense a whole. It's the wholeness of that person. I'm not attracted to like the brain of that person or the heart of that person. I'm attracted to the person as a person. There's something about that mysterious wholeness of that person that is attractive. And yet, we can trace that holonic, nature of nature to an ultimate degree that, from my perspective, I would name as God as the whole of the whole,
Mm-hmm.
or a divine being, or love, or whatever name we want to give to that ultimate wholeness that is within us and draws us.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Yeah, I really appreciate your views on nature, and as you've lectured about how, unfortunately in today's world of iPhones and the internet and so forth, we are disconnecting ourselves more than ever before, unfortunately, from the natural world. And where you use this wonderful a term of pancaking, where we're having this wide range of friends on Facebook and so forth, but it's very
Right.
it's very small. And this whole statement you make about how we're really struggling in this ever changing, rapidly evolving world of technology, and we need to relink in many ways with nature.
Yeah, we're kind of a fried egg phenomenon right
Yeah,
now. Just the eggs in the pan, but the whites all over the place. So,
yeah.
yeah, and I think in my view, the missing piece is like we know a lot from science and technology, and religion has just been excised from the whole thing, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the consciousness piece, that's the mind piece, that's the love piece, that's missing here. That's the connector piece
Mm-hmm.
that would connect us to the whole that we're so longing for.
Yeah.
So we're on our phones, and we're all isolated behind our screens, and we're depressed more and more because we're searching for something that we can't really name, and we don't even know what we're searching for. And I think if we could begin to have a conscious awareness that there's something that's within us and before us, that religions in the past have named as God or Allah or Yahweh or love itself or absolute consciousness, if we could begin to name this reality for ourselves, I think we might actually find interconnectivity shifting a little bit, how we
Mm-hmm.
connect. So yeah, a lot of my work these days is trying to bring artificial intelligence and religion together, you
Yeah.
know, in the
Yeah.
same dialogue.
Let's move into that area because you know, transhumanism as sort of a basket, you know, this group of tech, you know, it's an area that sort of, you know, I work in my day job's in regenerative medicine, so I sort of have my feet in different areas, and
Yeah.
I do interact with sort of the transhuman community, which, you know, broadly, you know, it's a movement that advocates for, you know, transforming the human condition
Mm-hmm.
via biologic means or silicon means
Right.
to enhance itself intellectually, physiologically, and so forth. And you've really had a lot of very interesting and profound ideas in this area. There was, you know, the recent article about robotic priests and the concept that whether any, I guess, any clergy could technically in today's world be imbued with the, you know, all the holy knowledge and none of this, as you say, the unholy behavior to advise. And I talked about a lot of these ideas, not just with my friends, with my children, and they were like, no, Dad, you can't do that. But then I was thinking back, you know, here I am, you know, raised as a conservative Jew, Reformed Jew now. And I think about, you know, it's kind of interesting because, you know, back in the day, when I was getting bar mitzvah and everything, you know, my rabbi was this old dude with a big beard, and he talked a certain way, and he smelled a certain way, and
Right.
and nowadays I look at my rabbi and I'm like, you know, are you 21 yet? I'm like, I want to have, you know, deep discussion with you about the cosmos, but you know, have you come out of the seminary? And I think, well, you know what? I guess I could, you know, deal with a robotic rabbi. Talk about some of this area, if you would, and you know, you, as I said, you have a lot of things you get into your presentations. You know, you talk about Jesus as a cyborg, Jesus as a strange attractor, a lot of really interesting concepts. I'm going to give you the floor on this one because we do touch on transhumanism at all levels in the show. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts and ideas.
So I just finished a book called Re-Enchanting the Earth, Why AI Needs Religion. So that'll come out next year.
Excellent.
And a lot of my thoughts here do take from Teilhard's notion of the noosphere, but let's talk a little bit about transhumanism. First of all, let me just say, I am really enamored of tech. I mean, I just am awed by what we have accomplished in technology.
Sure.
I think it's really amazing that we have the capacity to invent ourselves. In other words, we've invented technology that has changed us. That in itself is just amazing, that we could put information, you know, we could have chips, we can create paradigms to understand how information flows. You know, Norbert Wiener's work, Claude Shannon's work. I find Alan Turing's the whole thing of a Turing test, like who would take a machine and begin to question, gee, could this machine think like a human? I'm going to make this test and see if this is possible.
Sure.
That as a phenomenon, that's amazing that we have this capacity to question the very things we invent, right? The machines we make, and to question, can this machine think like a human? So I do find, you know, transhumanism as a phenomenon and our ability to create this stuff really quite amazing. However, I'm also rather suspicious that we can really just here's my little problem with transhumanism. It's really all about us, you know.
Right.
I can download my brain and I can get really smart, you know, or I can live on forever. God, who would want to live on forever? I don't know, but you know, there are people who just think, wow, that's the coolest thing. I don't want to live on forever in like this, you know. I mean, maybe in a different way. But so we can. I mean. You're in medicine, so yes, we've done amazing things in biomedical technology, right? Our lifespan is increasing. A lot of technology. I mean, without technology, medicine would not be where it is today. That's just the bottom line.
Absolutely.
And yet, what I think I learned from computer technology and artificial intelligence is something more about nature itself. And I think what I'm learning is that what we call the boundaries of nature are really not fixed boundaries.
Okay.
And therefore, what we're realizing is that what we are, even as human persons, these boundaries are not fixed. So I am more and more suspicious when people say, well, this is it. This is what we are. And, it's a make it or break it. And I'm like, well, not really. I mean, what artificial intelligence is really challenging us to think is that the human person is in transition, right? We are evolution now on the level of self-consciousness. So our boundaries can change. We are becoming something new. In this respect, I like the term, I like actually the philosophical concept of posthumanism better. It's interesting that transhumanism in some ways sort of continues. It's a very male project in some ways, and it continues the Enlightenment project, right? We don't need religion. We don't need a God anymore because now we are the gods, so to speak, right? We have the powers, the godly powers to create, to invent ourselves. And yet those godly powers in the 20th century were devastating. So I really am wary that we don't want to use technology to recreate the horrors of the 20th century.
Sure.
Posthumanism arises out of critical feminism. And here, I look at critical feminists like Judith Butler, and those who looked at, the boundaries of gender or the boundaries of race and saying, no, we are not ontologically defined by gender or race, that we're defined as persons. And so, they've pushed those boundaries. And I think posthumanism says, yeah, technology can shift our boundaries, but are our boundaries shifting towards greater personhood and relationality or not? That's what I think our question for AI must be. In our interconnected, globalized, electronic brain world, are we more connected and are we deepening our lives together or not? And this, I think, this is where I think religion can have a role here. Not religion in the institutional sense. I mean, what's the guiding, like, what are we connecting for? Like, what do we hope to achieve in our greater enhanced technological world? And I think technology itself, I mean, it's all over the place, right? It doesn't really have, like Google doesn't have a great big, ethical aim here. It's like, we'll get smarter, we'll have robots drive our cars, we'll have robotic medicine, or we won't need a lot of humans in the workforce anymore. So there's a whole contingent that says, gee, the human person's becoming now extinct and, replaceable. So who needs humans? And truthfully, they're kind of a mess anyway. So robots are going to be better. But that's problematic, in my view, because we are the universe. I don't want to leave the universe behind on this whole question of technology, right? So we are part of the Earth community. We're part of the cosmos. And I think once we disconnect ourselves from that cosmos, then we leave ourselves vulnerable to the whims of cosmic forces. And I think posthumanism says, no, we're embodied creatures, right? So what technology does, it extends our embodiment. Now that embodiment includes hyper-personalizing through electronic connections. What I am now can be extended through my social media connections, through my computer connections. My embodiment can actually widen in this, but I don't lose my body. I'm extended in my body. That's a posthumanism and a feminist, in a sense, perspective here. That what I am, and therefore I have to question, am I becoming more person and personnel through my connections, or am I becoming depersonalized through them?
Right.
That's the ethical question. And I think this is where we have to say, well, what's guiding my connectivities? Why am I connecting? Why am I compulsed to go online and shop online and find out what everyone's doing online? Is there something within me that I'm not attending to? Is there a power within me, a divine power that I'm not tending to? So I worry about the exoskeletal self, a self that's being lived outside itself, when the exoskeletal self must in some ways reflect the internal self. Who I am within must be extending itself to what I am without. And I think when we only live in the world without and we lose the sense within, we become disconnected. And I think that can actually lead to greater loneliness, to greater depersonalization. And then I worry about the horrors of depersonalization, where we begin to objectify everything. If we're just algorithms, right? If we're just numbers, if we're just different objects, then I worry that we can become a more horrific world, right? A world that really will thrive on destruction and violence. But if we can use technology to deepen what we are, and maybe I would say this, in Teilhard's view, he thought the noosphere, the level of electronic mind, could be the level of deepening heart. He thought of the noosphere as a new world soul. And that's really interesting. We haven't thought of it that way. We haven't structured it that way. But wouldn't that be really awesome if we could build a technospheric world as a new world soul that we're sharing? We're sharing a spiritual thread of our existence together. We're sharing a humanity together. We're sharing a vision for the planet together because technology now affords this. I think there are seeds of this around, but we haven't harnessed those seeds to kind of name the tree that might be growing in our midst, a new tree of life, so to speak. But I think of someone like, like little Greta Thunberg there, with her global climate change strike. I mean, you got to admit, pretty incredible that this little 16-year-old, could use social media to create a global mass movement of awareness that, we are in a predicament, with regard to warming. Now, of course, a lot of people will dispute this and all this kind of stuff, but the consciousness is raised, and pretty amazing that, school children in Japan and England and the US would strike, go on strike and demanding that there be some kind of an accountability for their future. That's a world soul movement. That's what we're talking about here when we talk about world soul. There's a shared interest, there's a shared beingness. And we can, and therefore, I think, use AI to actually deepen what we are. And that, in my view, is the post-human agenda for AI in the 21st century.
Excellent. Next couple questions I'm going to come to your pharmacologic training. To put that hat on for a moment. There's a few things here, and take your time with these. I've done a few shows recently on the topic of entheogens. So broadly defined as chemical substances that's typically of a plant origin, some synthetic, that can cause a so-called non-ordinary state of consciousness for either religious or spiritual purpose. I've had Dennis McKenna, the brother of the late Terence McKenna, on the show, who does all the work with magic mushrooms, and then Dr. Deborah Mash from University of Miami, who's studying ibogaine for opioid addiction. In a relational cosmos based on consciousness and of these kinds of, do entheogens have a role somewhere here? And how do you feel about being a neuropharmacologist? Could you talk a little bit about your feelings in this general area?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, I mean, this stuff was around even in the 60s and 70s, right? With, O'Leary and, the whole LSD thing. And my own mentor at Fordham actually was part of a project at Columbia with Gene Houston on exploring levels of consciousness with ethnogens, microdosing things. Sometimes I think we want a shift in consciousness. We want to tap into those deeper levels of consciousness by inducing them, so to speak, with, through the use of ethnogens or microdosing of some type of mind-altering substance. And yet, I think these changes in consciousness are already intrinsic within it. They're already there. The pharmaceuticals are already, the chemicals are already there. And in this way, I guess I'm a little bit old-fashioned, where if I go back to the ancients and across religious traditions, right, the mystical traditions are mind-altering traditions. Whether you go to the Kabbalistic or the Sufi or the Christian mystical traditions, it was, practices of fasting, of disciplining the mind. Buddhist meditation, these have as much a physiological changes, brain changes, as they do as spiritual changes. And why I think this is the difference here is we live in this type of I want the now experience, I want to have a shift in my now. And yet I think by having an induced physiological change, we never get to the deeper transformational change of personhood. And my concern would be like, cool, I can access different levels of consciousness by microdosing, but am I really a transformed person? And I guess here's my bottom line. We can't get to a different world unless we become a different type of person, artificial intelligence is trying to, transhumanism is trying to move in this direction. And yet I think we already have all that's necessary within us, believe it or not. We can, but we would have to change our patterns of life. I always say, we're really good at training the body. We go to the gyms, we go to the fitness centers. I'm all for physical fitness, but we don't train the soul. We've lost that deep inner center trainingness, which requires a whole different skill set. Deep time, slowing down, a patience and a perseverance, a sacrifice, a going against the self. That's part of the training of, and these type of things that make for transformed personal existence, I think would have a more lasting effect than an induced transformation that might be pharmacologically induced. They're transient, right? Once the drugs wear off, we're sort of back to where we were. Right. We can remember the experience, but we're not necessarily transformed by it, in a deeper way. So I'm not opposed to it entirely. It can be helpful for those who have a difficult time getting, if people are stuck. But I do think we have to take up a new mantle of maybe a prophetic type of self-discipline. If we really want a different world, can we ourselves become different types of persons without having to induce personhood? Because I do think nature has within it all the tools necessary to move beyond it.
Absolutely.
And that's the beauty of studying biology and chemistry and physiology, right? You just find how really super incredible we are already without having to, put anything on top of it. If things are dysfunctional, I can definitely see remedying it, with some kind of pharmaceutical agent or some kind of, introducing an agent to remedy the situation. But I think we need to give nature, ourselves as natural beings a little bit more credit. Right. And we need to challenge that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Continuing on this, biologic theme, in the biotech world where I hang out, a lot of times researchers, whether they're doing embryonic stem cell work or working with some nasty viruses or doing chimera type stuff, will be accused of, in quotes, playing God. In a relational wholeness, relational cosmos, where we define God as you have, is there work? In other words, is there work that we should not be doing, a la playing God?
Yeah.
And second to that, do you have, in the sense that you have so much exposure to science as well as theology, if there was a chance for you to go back to the lab at some point and do some new, neat transhumanist type stuff, research-wise, is there anything particular you're interested in exploring and looking through new horizons?
Good questions. Look, scientific research is really just very exciting, and it's very painstaking, you're working in a lab. It's not something that comes overnight, right? It's trial and error over and over and over. And yet, when you make even sometimes the smallest discovery, it can be just an amazing breakthrough. So there is something about that breaking through in understanding, how something works or what something's about, that for a moment in time, you do feel like you have some kind of like pretty near God, like I think I've discovered. And so I do understand kind of the God complex that can arise, but I think, truthfully, the bona fide scientist also stands in humility. Because it's so awesome. Sometimes you stand back and you go, wow, this is so incredible. That you can go either way. You can go, wow, I have this power, and this can really change everything about us, and I'm going to change the world. Or you can stand back and go, this is really awesome, and I haven't a clue of, how this could possibly, really work this way. I mean, this is, it's so beyond, the fact that we can even understand it is just amazing. So I think humility versus power, and what makes one stand on one side or the other. I think the humble scientist, or when I say humble, I mean someone who really, he knows who he is or she is, and they're using their knowledge to kind of deepen the frontiers of what we are, rather than using that knowledge as a source of power. And really, I think it's not about science per se. Science is an exploratory area of knowledge. To me, it's always, I once likened doing science to the whole spiritual journey. It's a kind of a religious journey in itself, right? There's something that keeps drawing us in these questions. Like, why do we want to understand, the inside of a neuron or the inside of a protein? There's something what is it that draws us to this? So that's a fascinating question itself. In the same way that what draws us to seek God, what is this power that's pulling us? So just the whole horizon of the knowing process is really, really interesting in science and in religion. I do think the scientists, I think we can have what Whitehead might call a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. We can take our little bit of knowledge and think that we know, we know everything now there is to know. When in fact, no, really what you know is this little piece of knowledge of a much, much infinitely vaster field of things to know. And so it's always, I think, keeping the window of discoveries within the much wider window of the infinite universe and the ever shifting horizon of wholeness that keeps drawing us to do these things. So I'm all for science. I love it. And would I go back to the lab? I would, actually, if I had the opportunity. I miss it. I miss the lure of discovery. I mean, I remember spending days and weeks and months in a lab, behind a lot of oscilloscopes and a lot of instruments, thinking, oh my God, am I ever going to find anything here? And when I did, I remember the first day, the time I first saw, this is back in 1982, the trace of an action potential. I was just beginning to do single cell recordings in motor neurons. And when I saw that action potential trace across my oscilloscope, it was like, oh my God, I am recording from a single motor neuron, this is so incredible. So I went running down the hallway, There's something about discovery in that world of science that just, in the same way, I have to tell you, it's the same in theology. When you come to an insight about the divine or about the things of the spirit, that too is really, there's something about insight and discovery that is just breathtaking. It's just the whole world sort of rises up. Sure. So if I were to go back into science, I would actually love to go back to the area of Alzheimer's disease and really try to find a cure for it. I would love to be able to untangle those neurofilaments and find out what's going on there for sure. I'm fascinated by, I'm also fascinated by CRISPR and by gene editing stuff that's going on. And I'm fascinated by the whole area of consciousness in the brain. So I don't know. I would find something,
You found a lot of things to do.
I would find a lot of things to do, and I would definitely go. I think science is, I try to tell my colleagues in theology, you need to pay attention to science is a very, very cool area, but humanities, it's really interesting. There's this distancing from the sciences because they think, that's so, I can't understand what they're talking about. It's so foreign. And so science has kind of quasi, demagogic type of thing, and it's out there, in its specializations. And it's such a shame, because I think these are two areas that actually have a lot of common ground when you begin to see them in the same room. Yeah.
Now the toughest question of them all, and this one comes from my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter, and bear with me on this one.
Okay.
So I told you I have 3 kids, 2 boys, 17 and 15, and my daughter's 12, and
wow.
I expose them to all topics: science, religion, philosophy, whatever, and it makes for very lively.
Great.
Drives in the morning to school. So we talked about you the last couple of days, and my older son, he's taking courses in comparative religion, and it's really cool, kind of Eastern philosophy stuff. And then my other son, he's really into AI and robotics and all that. This is really cool.
Well, typical.
Then you hear a little voice from behind me in the car, and my daughter says, "Oh yeah, Dad. Well, where's Hitler in all of this?" And then the car gets quiet, and everyone's like, and they're very concerned in a relational universe with love at its core about evil.
Yes.
And whether that's Hitler or Osama bin Laden or whatever, they're very concerned that relational universe expunges. Let's say evolves and learns from evil and gets rid of it. Could you say a few words about evil and it all, and
no,
I can make her feel better about it?
Yeah, that's a really profound question. Yeah, no, for sure, right? So, Tarot would say that. Two things. Our Catholic perspective was we had this garden and Adam and Eve, and we fell in all this kind of stuff and ate from the wrong tree and evil entered in. I just don't buy it. I do think I would place this notion of what we might say brokenness or disconnectedness, where evil is the absence of the good. The absence of love is evil. And I think, even if we were to look at this in terms of human individuation, in terms of evolution, in evolution, we evolve into higher levels of consciousness and brain complexity, right? So we evolve into a level of human individuation, of personhood. You can look at, you go back to Neanderthals, for example, that there was a whole different level of consciousness of person. One would never think of oneself as an individual, and even in pre-axial consciousness, one always thinks in terms of the community. So in pre-axial consciousness, it would be community and personhood. In axial consciousness is personhood and community, right? So the emphasis switches to, guess what? I'm aware that I am a person and I'm different from you. Now, why I say that is because once we individuate consciousness and personhood, we then come into, that's also the level of symbolic language. It's the level of moral order. It's the level of free will. So I can think in terms of a way that I am not you, and I can reject you, And I think evil is, in a sense, that rejection of personhood and that rejection of belonging to a whole. And that's the way. One way we might look at evil is that I am not aware of belonging to a whole. I'm aware of myself as an individual distinct from the whole. And I will use that distinction as a power over the whole. And therefore, it's a rejection of belonging to something larger than ourselves. Once we reject belonging to a whole, then we have an autonomous power that can try to demolish that whole. That this is rise. And so I think what, even bracketing religion for the moment, the rise of the autonomous liberal subject, the autonomous individual, is the most dangerous, I think, that can happen, right? I think that it's only when we recognize that we belong to something that's more than ourselves, that we then have a responsibility for something other than ourselves, right? And so we talk about evil. Many of the Christian writers would talk about evil as the absence of the good, right? Where that good is just quenched, it's crushed. And when we do that, we are no longer in relationality. We are in the Newtonian world of the isolated part. And therefore we objectify person. Persons are no longer person. A person is a relational being. And when we lose relationality, we reduce persons to objects, to manipulate, to control, to annihilate. Then we're in a dangerous situation. That's a Hitler or an Osama bin Laden. That's where power rises up. It's a power over. It's a power of domination. And I think that comes out of a deep fear, in my view, a deep, deep fear of relationality, and therefore a rejection of wholeness. It's a rejection of relationality. And I think that's precisely why we're trying to, trying to get ourselves beyond this level. We have collapsed personhood in the axial period. Once we became individuated, that the cost of individuation was, in a sense, the collapse of the whole. And I think we are in a new level of consciousness where we are seeking to get out of the rubble of that collapse into a new relational wholeness.
Thank you for that. I will take that message to her and assuage her concerns. But I appreciate you going into that.
We will move beyond it, but I think we have to be careful not to repeat it. Yep. And this is where I think some forms of transhumanism can move in that direction. We have to be careful that we don't repeat the isolated individual of the 20th century. I think nature itself is trying to move beyond that collapse of personhood and trying to, if I can use the word, resurrect personhood as relational being in wholeness.
One final question. I said a couple of months ago on one of your presentations, and you had hurt your leg. I think you mentioned that you had fallen off your mountain bike or your bike, and I learned that you were an avid cyclist. In addition to pondering the cosmos and and thinking of all of these types of things and teaching and running the Omega Center, what does Ilia Delio do for fun in addition?
So I love cycling and I love music. So I've been taking guitar lessons. I play guitar. Nice. I play guitar and piano, but I've always been sort of a closet guitarist and pianist. But I've been taking lessons for the last year, and I'm learning some really cool things in terms. My latest song is Eric Clapton's Layla, so I'm learning all this. The actual chords of that song, learning new bar chords and stuff. And so, my dream one day is to join a rock group, believe it or not, I think music and art are so necessary for our age. I think music is about passion and creativity and personalization. It's expressive of, feeling. It's expressive of who we are. And so I do love rock music, quite honestly. So sort of making up for when I immersed myself in theology, I sort of moved away from rock. So I'm coming back to it now. So that's what I do with my pastime. I practice guitar, and it's over there in the corner, by the way, if you can see it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Ilia, it's been such a both an honor and a pleasure having you join us today and share your amazing knowledge and mind with us and everything you're doing. Clearly, as we say, sort of the theme of the show, sort of creating the future with ideas, and it's just you speak so elegantly about it all. It's so enlightening and refreshing in today's world where things are, as you say, more and more connected, but the reestablishment of nature in the picture, and the reestablishment of love, the integrated concepts, where we're unfortunately getting a little too reductionist, in my opinion, are so crucial to reconnecting with. And it's
Yep.
just, really appreciating your time. For everybody that's going to be watching on the channel, and for those that will be listening in on the radio networks, we've been spending time with the amazing Ilia Delio, Josephine C. and Connelly Endowed Chair at Theology at Villanova University, head of the Omega Center in Villanova. It's just been an absolute pleasure listening to everything you have to say, and I'm just thank you for what you do, and everything that you bring to humanity with your work and your knowledge. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Ira. It's been a joy to share with you.
Thanks so much for your time.
All right.